blizzard hit Copper Ridge at 3 p.m. on February 9th, 1884. Within 22 minutes, the temperature plummeted 40 degrees, a white wall of violence that erased the world in seconds. It turned farmers into frozen statues just yards from their own front doors. But while the respectable citizens of Montana Territory were freezing in their well-built homes, the only person prepared for the apocalypse was a 16-year-old boy living in a hole in the ground. His name was Jem. To the God-fearing folks of Copper Ridge, he was just that stray, a ragged, dirty-faced orphan who scavenged behind the saloon. But the truth was uglier. For the last decade, Jem had been the unpaid labor for Silas and Martha Vance, a couple who ran a failing farm on the edge of town. They were the kind of people who sang the loudest in church on Sunday and counted every grain of salt on Monday. They didn't keep Jem out of charity. They kept him because the state paid a monthly stipend for his upkeep, money that went straight into Silas's whiskey jar, never onto Jem's back. But today was different. Today was Jem's 16th birthday. The kitchen smelled of burnt grease and stale coffee. Outside, the wind was already picking up, whistling through the cracks in the Vance's drafty cabin. Jem sat at the end of the table staring at his plate, a single dry heel of bread. "Stop eyeing the meat, boy," Silas growled, shoveling a forkful of gristle into his mouth. "You eat what you earn, and you ain't earned much lately." Jem didn't answer. His eyes flicked to the window. Outside, shivering in the snow, was a 3-legged mongrel dog with ribs showing through its matted coat. It was Copper, the only living thing in the territory that looked at Jem with anything other than contempt. Silas looked away to pour more coffee. In that split second, Jem moved. He didn't take the good meat. He grabbed a piece of burnt fat, hard as a rock, that Martha had set aside for the trash. He palmed it, intending to slip it out to Copper later. "I saw that." Silas's hand slammed onto the table, rattling the tin cups. He stood up, his face purple with rage. It wasn't about the fat, it was trash after all. It was about control. "You stealing from me, under my roof?" Silas roared. "It was for the dog," Jem said quietly. "He's starving." "That 3-legged rat?" Silas sneered. He looked at Jem, a cruel glint in his eye. "You know what day it is, boy? It's February 9th. You're 16 today. You know what that means? The state don't pay me a dime for you anymore. You're a grown man now, according to the law. And I don't support grown men who steal my scraps." Silas walked to the door and threw it open. The cold air rushed in, biting and bitter. "Get out!" "Silas, the storm," Martha mumbled, though she didn't look up from her knitting. "He's a man now. Let him find his own way. Get out!" Silas grabbed Jem's collar and shoved him. Jem stumbled out into the snow, the door slamming shut behind him with a finality that echoed like a gunshot. He stood there, shivering in his thin, tattered coat. He looked at the closed door, then down at the piece of burnt fat still clutched in his hand. He tossed it to Copper. The dog swallowed it in one gulp and licked Jem's frozen hand. "Happy birthday to me," Jem whispered. He should have been terrified. He had no money, no parents, and no future. But as he turned his back on the Vance's farm, Jem didn't cry. He smiled, because he knew something they didn't. For 2 years, while the town watched him dragging trash toward the limestone cliffs, they had laughed. Mayor Blackburn had called him an embarrassment, a rat living in a rock pile. They saw a crazy kid hauling broken fence posts, discarded wool blankets from the livery stable, and sacks of stale flour the baker threw out. They didn't see the engineering. They didn't know that deep inside that limestone fissure, past the narrow gap that looked like a crack in the rock face. The physics of the earth changed. Jem and Copper walked 2 miles against the rising wind. When they reached the cliffs, Jem squeezed through the jagged opening. Instantly the world changed. The biting wind vanished. The silence was heavy and protective. It wasn't hot, but it wasn't cold. It was a constant, steady 54 degrees, unaffected by the brutal Montana winter. Jem struck a match. The light revealed his trash. The fence posts were stacked into a drying rack. The spoiled flour had been sifted and stored in stone jars. The scavenged wool blankets formed a thick, insulated bed on a platform of cedar boughs. He wasn't a stray dog finding a corner to die in. He was a survivor, entering his fortress. Outside, the sky turned a sickly, sulphurous yellow, the color of old bruises. The birds went silent. The pressure dropped so sharp it made Jem's head ache. "It's coming, Copper," Jem said, stroking the dog's head. "The big one." The Vances were about to learn that a house made of wood and hypocrisy couldn't stop the wind, but the boy they kicked out, he was already home. The silence was the loudest thing Jem had ever heard. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a winter night. It was a heavy, suffocating stillness that pressed against the eardrums. Deep inside the limestone fissure, the air remained a steady, comforting 54 degrees. But Jem couldn't sit still. He paced the stone floor of his sanctuary, the soles of his worn boots scuffing against the rock. Outside, the sky had turned a color that shouldn't exist in nature. It wasn't gray and it wasn't white. It was a sickly, bruised yellow, sulphurous and angry. It looked like the underside of a dying storm cloud, but it stretched from horizon to horizon. Jem stepped out onto the ledge, shielding his eyes. The hair on his arms stood straight up. Static electricity buzzed in the air, sharp and metallic, tasting like copper on the back of his tongue. "You feel that, boy?" Jem whispered. Copper was already whining. The 3-legged dog, usually eager to chase rabbits or sniff out trap lines, was cowering near the cave entrance, ears flattened against his skull. He stared fixedly at the northern horizon, his body trembling with a primal instinct that predated human civilization. Then the headache hit. It wasn't a normal ache. It was a pressure change, so sharp it made Jem stagger, a dull throb behind his eyes that signaled a catastrophic drop in the barometer. Jem looked at the town of Copper Ridge, nestled in the valley below like a toy village. Smoke curled lazily from stone chimneys. Men were walking into the saloon. A carriage rattled down Main Street. They were completely oblivious. They were looking at the calendar, seeing February, and expecting just another snow flurry. Jem looked at his stockpile, the dry wood, the cured meat, the safety of his hole. He had just been kicked out of society. He had been told he was worthless, a burden, a thief. By all rights, he should let them freeze. He should seal the entrance and sleep warm, while the people who called him trash turned into ice sculptures. But he cursed under his breath, grabbed his tattered coat, and started running. He wasn't a hero. He was a 16-year-old outcast with a chip on his shoulder the size of Montana. But he couldn't just watch them die. He hit the town limits, lungs burning, his boots skidding on the frozen mud. He didn't go to the church, and he didn't go to the saloon. He went straight to the First National Bank, the heart of Copper Ridge's arrogance. Sheriff Virgil Tatum was standing outside, leaning against a pillar and enjoying a midday cigar. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, with a badge that caught the weird yellow light, and an attitude that came from 20 years of being the law. "Sheriff," Jem gasped, doubling over, hands on his knees. Tatum looked down, his eyes narrowing. He didn't see a concerned citizen. He saw the Vance kid, the newly minted vagrant he'd heard Silas complaining about that morning. "You're far from your rock piles, son," Tatum said, not unkindly, but with a dismissal that stung worse than a slap. "Did Silas finally kick you to the curb?" "The sky," Jem choked out, pointing a shaking finger north. "Look at the sky, Sheriff. The pressure. It dropped too fast. The birds stopped singing. It's coming. A big one. You gotta ring the church bell. Get folks inside. Get wood." Tatum took a slow drag of his cigar, exhaling a plume of blue smoke that hung motionless in the dead air. He looked at the sky, then back at the boy. "It's winter, Jim. It snows. That's what it does." "Not like this," Jem pleaded, stepping closer. "My dog, he won't leave the cave. The air feels wrong. It's going to be a killer." The door to the bank swung open and Mayor Cornelius Blackburn stepped out. He was a man who wore a three-piece suit, even in July, checking his gold pocket watch, with the air of a man who believed time waited for him. "Is this nuisance bothering you, Sheriff?" Blackburn asked, his lip curling as he spotted Jem's oversized, patched coat. "Just telling him to move along, Mayor," Tatum said, flicking ash near Jem's worn-out boots. "It's an embarrassment," Blackburn sneered, adjusting his silk tie. "Silas Vance told me he cut you loose this morning. That means you're officially a vagrant, boy. We have laws in this town. We don't need rats from the rock pile scaring decent folks just to beg for a handout." "I ain't begging," Jem's voice cracked, frustration warring with fear. "I'm telling you, you're going to die in those houses. The walls act like ice boxes when the wind hits. You need to get underground or come to the cave." Blackburn laughed. It was a dry, hollow sound. "The cave? You want the good citizens of Copper Ridge to crawl into a hole in the ground with a stray dog and a beggar? I'd rather freeze." Tatum stepped off the curb, his hand drifting toward his belt. The pity was gone from his eyes, replaced by the cold, hard stare of authority. "You heard the mayor, Jem," Tatum said, his voice dropping an octave. "Get lost. Go back to your hole. If I see you on Main Street in 10 minutes, I'm locking you up for vagrancy. And the jail cell is a hell of a lot colder than your cave." Jem looked at them. He saw the polished leather of their boots, the wool of their fine coats, and the absolute, impenetrable wall of their arrogance. They thought their money and their titles were a shield. They thought nature cared about their bank accounts. "You're right," Jem said softly, backing away. "I'm just the rat." He turned and ran. He ran past the general store where Mrs. Garrison was arranging bread in the window. He ran past the blacksmith shop where Thomas Hollister was hammering a horseshoe, oblivious to the fact that his forge was about to be the only heat source left in the world. Jem reached the limestone cliffs just as the world ended. He scrambled up the scree, diving through the narrow fissure of the cave entrance. Copper was waiting, barking frantically. Jem rolled onto the dry floor of the cave, gasping for air. And then it happened. The wind didn't build up. It arrived. It hit the mountain with a sound like a freight train, derailing directly overhead. The light outside vanished instantly, replaced by a swirling, screaming wall of white violence. The temperature crashed so hard and so fast that the sap in the pine trees outside exploded with sounds like pistol shots. Jem crawled to the opening and looked out. The town of Copper Ridge was gone. Erased. He was safe. The rat was warm in his nest. But as the screams of the wind tore through the Montana silence, Jem didn't feel triumphant. He sat by his small fire, pulled his knees to his chest, and waited for the dying to start. The wind didn't just blow. It screamed. It sounded like a freight train derailing directly overhead, a mechanical shriek that tore through the Montana silence and replaced it with a deafening, white roar. Inside the limestone fissure, the air remained still, but the noise from outside vibrated against Jem's chest like a second heartbeat. He sat on his haunches near the small fire he'd built at the back of the cave's main chamber, feeding it a single piece of dried scrub oak with the precision of a diamond cutter. He was 16 years old, but in the flickering light, his face looked older, hardened by a lifetime of other people's indifference. He was safe. He had his scavenged blankets, a stash of dried meat he'd traded rabbit pelts for, and enough wood to last a week. By all rights, he should have felt triumphant. The town that had kicked him out on his birthday, the parents who had tossed him aside like garbage, were now freezing, while the rat was warm in his nest. But he couldn't sit still. Beside him, Copper paced nervously, his nails clicking against the stone floor. The three-legged dog let out a low, anxious whine that echoed off the damp walls. "I know, buddy," Jem whispered, his voice cracking. "They're going to die out there." He thought about Jessa Hollister. The blacksmith's niece was the only person in Copper Ridge who had ever looked at him without curling her lip. She had slipped him a hot biscuit once when her uncle wasn't looking. She had asked him his name and actually waited for the answer. Jem grabbed a jagged stick and a piece of red flannel he'd found in the trash behind the general store months ago. It was torn and stained with grease, but it was bright enough to bleed through the whiteout. "Stay," he commanded Copper. Jem pushed himself up and walked toward the entrance. As he neared the gap in the rocks, the temperature dropped sharply. He took a breath, braced his shoulder against the limestone slab, and shoved his arm out into the storm. The wind hit him like a physical blow, nearly wrenching his arm from its socket. The cold was instantaneous, feeling less like air and more like 1,000 needles stabbing his skin. He jammed the stick into a deep crack in the outer rock face, praying the wind wouldn't snap it, and let the red cloth whip violently in the gale. It was a beacon, a pathetic, tiny red flag in a world gone white, a lifeline thrown by the town outcast. He retreated back into the calm of the cave, shivering violently. Now, all he could do was wait. Time distorted in the darkness. Minutes stretched into hours. Jem paced. He rearranged his wood pile. He checked the ventilation crack in the ceiling where the smoke drifted out, ensuring the snow hadn't choked it off. Then Copper barked. Not a warning bark, but a sharp, alert yip. Jem grabbed his lantern and held it high. A hand appeared through the limestone gap. It was covered in a thick wool mitten encrusted with ice. Then a shoulder shaking violently. Jem rushed forward, planting his feet. He grabbed the arm and pulled with all the strength of a farm-hardened 16-year-old. "Come on, pull." Jessa Hollister stumbled into the cave, followed by her mother and father, the town blacksmith. They didn't walk. They fell. They collapsed onto the stone floor, gasping for air, their eyebrows and eyelashes frozen into white masks. Thomas Hollister was a giant of a man who had once chased Jem off his property with a hammer, calling him a thief. Now he was reduced to a shivering, helpless heap. He couldn't even unclench his hands. "The wind," Thomas stammered, his voice unrecognizable. "It took the roof. Just took it." "Get closer to the fire," Jem ordered. His voice sounded strange to his own ears. Authoritative, steady. He wasn't the town stray anymore. He was the landlord. "Don't sit on the stone. Sit on the blankets. The stone will suck the heat right out of you." Jessa looked up at him, her face pale and waxy. "You were right," she whispered, her teeth chattering so hard the words were barely intelligible. "The red cloth. We saw it. We would have walked right past." Jem handed her a tin cup of water he'd warmed near the fire. Drink this. Small sips. Thomas Hollister sat up, groaning. Instinct took over. He was a man of action, used to fixing things with fire and iron. He saw the small, conservation-minded flame Jem was tending, a meager pile of twigs, and frowned. Boy, Thomas grumbled, his voice thick with cold. That fire's pitiful. We're freezing. Throw a log on. He reached for a piece of the precious scrub oak Jem had spent months dragging up the cliffside. Don't touch it, Jem said. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. The tone was flat, hard, and final. Thomas paused, his hand hovering over the wood. He looked at Jem, blinking as if seeing him for the first time. Excuse me? You throw a big log on, you choke the draft, Jem explained, standing tall. He wasn't the cowering kid Thomas remembered. See that crack in the ceiling? That's the chimney. It pulls the smoke out. But the wind outside is pushing back hard. If you build a bonfire in here, the smoke won't have nowhere to go but down. You'll suffocate us all in 10 minutes. Thomas looked at the crack, then back at the boy. The blacksmith slowly pulled his hand back. It ain't about heat, Mr. Hollister, Jem continued, poking the embers. It's about airflow. The cave stays at 54 degrees. The fire is just for morale and melting snow. You want to survive, or you want to be warm for 5 minutes before you choke to death? A silence settled over the group. The social hierarchy of Copper Ridge had just collapsed. The man who could bend horseshoes was taking orders from the boy he'd chased away. Before Thomas could answer, Copper barked again. This time, it was Cordelia Garrison, the widow who ran the bakery. She tumbled through the entrance alone, clutching a basket against her chest like a shield. She was covered in snow from head to toe, looking more like a snowman than a person. I closed the shop, she wheezed, sliding down the wall. The windows blew in, glass everywhere. I grabbed what I could. She opened the basket. Inside were 3 loaves of bread, frozen rock hard. It's not much, Cordelia said, looking at Jem with wide, terrified eyes. I remembered what you said about the cave. I thought you were just a boy playing games. It ain't a game, ma'am, Jem said quietly, taking the basket. It's 54 degrees in here, always. The dynamic in the cave shifted instantly. Here were the adults, the shopkeepers, the tradesmen, the people who built the town and made the rules. And there was Jem, the 16-year-old they had spat on, standing over them with dry wood and a dry floor. They were terrified. They were freezing. And they were looking at him, not with contempt, but with desperation. They were waiting for him to tell them what to do. We need to ration the wood, Jem said, his survival instincts kicking in. And we need to melt snow for water. Mr. Hollister, you're big. Block the wind at the entrance with those loose stones, but leave a crack for air. We don't want to suffocate. The blacksmith nodded, scrambling to obey the teenager's command without hesitation. Outside, the storm howled like a banshee, burying Copper Ridge under a mountain of white death. But inside the rat's nest, for the first time in his life, Jem wasn't the one on the outside looking in. He was the one keeping the fire burning. And the night was just beginning. The fire in the center of the limestone chamber was small, a fragile orange heart beating against the encroaching dark. Jem sat cross-legged on the dirt floor, feeding twigs into the flames. He knew exactly how long each piece of scrub oak would burn. He had learned the hard way during those long, lonely nights after escaping the Vance farm that running out of wood in a Montana winter wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a death sentence. Around him, the social hierarchy of Copper Ridge had collapsed into a shivering semicircle. Thomas Hollister, the blacksmith whose hands could bend iron, was huddled under a moth-eaten blanket, rubbing his wife's frozen shoulders. Cordelia Garrison, the baker who made the best sourdough in the territory, was weeping softly, clutching her basket of frozen bread like it was the crown jewels. They were alive because of a boy they had called a rat. The irony wasn't lost on Jem, but he didn't have time to gloat. The storm outside had shifted gears. It wasn't just a blizzard anymore. It was a siege. The wind howled with a demonic fury, shaking the very ground beneath their feet. Copper, curled by Jem's knee, suddenly lifted his head. His ears swiveled toward the jagged crack of the entrance. A low growl rumbled in his chest, vibrating against Jem's leg. "What is it, boy?" Jem whispered. The dog sprang up, barking sharply at the darkness. It wasn't his usual warning bark. It was a frantic, pleading yelp. "Someone's out there?" Jessa Hollister whispered, her eyes wide with terror. Jem didn't hesitate. At 16, his reflexes were sharp, honed by years of dodging Silas Vance's backhands. He grabbed his lantern and a coil of rough hemp rope he'd scavenged from the livery stable months ago. "Mr. Hollister, hold this end," Jem commanded, tossing the rope to the blacksmith. "Don't let go, no matter what." The big man nodded, his face pale but set. He wrapped the rope around his forearm, anchoring himself against a boulder. Jem tied the other end around his waist. He looked at the tunnel leading to the entrance. It was a throat ready to swallow him whole. He took a deep breath and plunged in. The cold hit him like a physical slap, stealing the air from his lungs. He crawled toward the gap, the wind screaming so loud it drowned out his own thoughts. Snow blinded him, stinging his face like buckshot. And then he saw it. A dark shape was wedged into the crevice between the limestone slabs. It wasn't moving. The snow had already begun to drift over it, burying it alive. Jem lunged forward, grabbing a handful of thick wool coat. The body was heavy, dead weight. He dug his heels into the frozen dirt, his boots slipping on the ice. "Help me!" he screamed, though the wind tore the words away. He wasn't alone. Copper was there, grabbing the sleeve with his teeth, pulling alongside his boy. The dog's paws scrabbled on the rock, his growls lost in the roar of the storm. Together, inch by agonizing inch, they dragged the figure out of the killing wind and into the shelter of the tunnel. Jem collapsed back, gasping, his chest heaving. He held the lantern up. As the light hit the man's face, Jem stopped cold. It was Sheriff Virgil Tatum. The man who had threatened to lock Jem up for vagrancy just hours ago was now a husk. His face was a mask of white frost. His eyebrows were frozen solid. But he wasn't alone. Clutched tightly against his chest, wrapped inside his massive buffalo hide coat, was a small bundle. "Get them to the fire!" Jem yelled, his voice cracking. Mr. Hollister and Jessa scrambled forward, helping drag the sheriff into the main chamber. They laid him near the warmth, but not too close. Jem knew the danger of shock. Tatum's eyes fluttered open. They were glassy, unfocused. His lips were blue. He tried to speak, but his jaw was locked tight. With a trembling hand, he motioned to his chest. Jessa peeled back the heavy coat. A collective gasp went through the cave. It was a little girl, Rosie Miller, the 5-year-old daughter of the family who lived on the edge of town. She was unconscious, her skin pale as milk. But as the heat of the fire hit her, she let out a weak, ragged cough. "She's alive," Cordelia sobbed, reaching out to chafe the girl's tiny hands. "Oh, thank God." But the sheriff was in worse shape. Much worse. Jem looked at Tatum's hands. They were curled into claws, the gloves missing. The fingers weren't red. They were a dull, waxy gray, deepening to black at the tips. Frostbite, deep frostbite. Mr. Hollister, driven by a desperate need to be useful, reached for the sheriff's hands. "We need to get the blood moving. Rub them out." "Don't touch him," Jem snapped. The command cracked like a whip in the small space. The blacksmith froze, looking at the 16-year-old boy. "What?" "If you rub them, You'll tear the tissue, Jem said, his voice shaking but firm. He stepped between Hollister and the sheriff. It's like frozen meat, Mr. Hollister. You rub frozen meat, it shreds. You gotta warm 'em slow. Cool water first, then warm. Jem grabbed a bucket of melted snow water he'd set aside earlier. It was lukewarm. He took the sheriff's ruined hands and gently submerged them. Tatum groaned, a sound of pure animal pain, as the blood began to force its way back into the dying nerves. His eyes squeezed shut, tears leaking out and mixing with the melting frost on his cheeks. After a moment he blinked, his vision clearing enough to focus on the face hovering above him. He saw the dirt-smudged cheeks, the ragged, oversized coat, the eyes of the boy he had told to get lost. "Jem?" Tatum rasped, his voice sounding like grinding gravel. "I got you, Sheriff," Jem said quietly, keeping his hands steady on the bucket. "You're in the hole. You're safe." Tatum looked around the cave. He saw the fire, the stockpile of wood, the dry floor. He saw the rat's nest he had mocked, now the only warm place in a world gone to hell. He looked at Rosie, now being cradled by Jessa. I found her," Tatum whispered, the words slurring. "Her folks, they didn't make it? Just yards from the door?" "Rest now," Jem said. He wasn't asking. The power dynamic in the cave had shifted irrevocably. The badge on Tatum's chest meant nothing here. The blacksmith's muscles meant nothing. The only thing that mattered was the knowledge Jem had gathered while the rest of them were sleeping in feather beds. Jem stood up and looked at his guests. 7 people, 1 dog. And the storm was just getting started. He walked to the back of the cave where he kept his secret stash, the one he hadn't shown them yet. He pulled out a piece of dried venison jerky. He broke it in half and gave the bigger piece to Copper. "Good boy," he whispered. Outside, the wind slammed against the cliff face, frustrated that it couldn't reach them. Inside, the mad kid's hole had become a sanctuary. The boy they had thrown away was the only thing standing between them and the dark. By the 3rd day, the rat's nest smelled of wet wool, wood smoke, and the sour tang of fear. The initial relief of surviving the blizzard's opening salvo had evaporated, replaced by a gnawing, claustrophobic hunger that turned reasonable people into cornered animals. The wind outside hadn't stopped. It was a relentless, grinding roar that vibrated through the limestone walls, a constant reminder that the world outside was dead. Inside, the 27 refugees were alive, but they were running on fumes. Jem sat perched on a limestone ledge, his legs dangling, watching his guests with the wary eyes of a hawk guarding its nest. At 16, he wasn't just a boy playing house. He was the warden of a prison where the only alternative to confinement was death. Thomas Hollister woke up first, groaning as he stretched his stiff back. He looked around, disoriented, before his eyes landed on Jem. "Boy," Thomas grumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "The bucket's empty. My throat feels like I swallowed a handful of sand." "I'll get it," Jessa said, starting to stand up. "I can go to the entrance and—" "No," Jem cut in. His voice was low, but carried the weight of command. "You go to the entrance, the wind'll suck the heat right out of your bones. And the snow out there is dirty now, full of dust and grit." He whistled for Copper. The 3-legged dog trotted over, tail wagging. "Come on, I'll show you the plumbing." Jem grabbed the lantern and motioned for Jessa and Mr. Hollister to follow him. He led them away from the main chamber, squeezing through a narrow passage that looked impossibly tight. Thomas hesitated, claustrophobia flickering in his eyes. But he followed. The passage opened up into a smaller, deeper chamber. The air here smelled different, clean, mineral-heavy, and wet. In the center of the room, a pool of water reflected the lantern light like black glass. "It's an underground spring," Jem said, dipping a ladle into the water. "Clear as glass. Never freezes. The rock filters it." Thomas stared at the water, dumbfounded. "You've had fresh water this whole time? While the town pump freezes every January?" "The rock protects it," Jem said simply. "Limestone is porous. It drinks the water and keeps it moving." They filled the buckets in reverent silence. As they walked back to the main chamber, the dynamic shifted again. These weren't just refugees anymore. They were students, but hydration couldn't fix hunger. The tension finally snapped over a piece of dried venison. Prudence Peaton, the mayor's wife, had arrived on the second day, rescued by her husband's servants just before the general store's roof caved in. She was a woman used to silk sheets and hot tea served on silver trays. Now, sitting on a dirt floor wrapped in a horse blanket, she was watching Jem divide the meager rations. "That's it?" Prudence's voice was shrill, cutting through the low murmur of the cave. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at the sliver of meat in her palm. "A mouthful? We're freezing to death in a hole, and you expect us to survive on scraps?" The cave went silent. Sheriff Tatum, dozing near the fire, opened one eye. Jem didn't look up from his knife. "We eat light now, so we eat later, Mrs. Petton. Storm ain't done." "You're hoarding," Prudence accused, standing up. Her shadow stretched long and distorted against the cave wall. "I know your kind. You're the Vance boy, a thief and a stray. You're keeping the good supplies for yourself and that beast." She glared at Copper. "We are respectable citizens. We will not be starved by a street urchin." Jem stopped cutting. He slowly wiped the blade on his pant leg and stood up. At 16, he was already taller than Prudence. He looked her dead in the eye, his expression unreadable. "You think I'm holding out?" Jem asked quietly. "I think you're a thief," Prudence spat. Without a word, Jem grabbed the lantern. "Come with me." He led the group, Prudence, the sheriff, and Thomas Hollister, past the sleeping area toward the back of the cave where the shadows were deepest. He stopped at a pile of loose rocks that looked like a cave-in. With a grunt of effort, Jem pulled a large, flat slab aside. Behind it was a narrow niche, cool and dry. Stacked neatly inside were sacks of flour, jars of pickled vegetables, and strips of smoked meat hanging from hooks he'd hammered into the rock. But it wasn't the kind of food Prudence was used to. The flour sacks were stained, discards from the bakery. The vegetables were the bruised, ugly ones the grocer couldn't sell. The meat was the tough cuts, the gristle, the parts of the animal usually thrown to the dogs. "I've been saving this for 2 years, Jem said, his voice echoing off the stone. "Every time folks threw out a bruised apple or a piece of gristle, I brought it here. I fixed it. I saved it. For a bad winter." He looked Prudence dead in the eye. "You called it trash. You laughed when I dragged it up here. Well, ma'am, this is the trash that's keeping you alive." He gestured to the stockpile. "I didn't save it for me. I saved it for bad times. I guess you folks are the bad times." Prudence stared at the stockpile. It wasn't a fortune, but in the middle of the apocalypse, it was a king's ransom. The woman who had called him a rat deflated, her face flushing red in the lantern light. She didn't say thank you. She couldn't. Her pride was the only thing she had left. But she went back to her spot, sat down in the dirt, and ate her ration in silence. Jem watched her go, then tossed a small piece of the trash meat to Copper. The dog caught it in the air, a silent partner in the only bank in town that hadn't gone bust. The 5th day brought a different kind of darkness. It wasn't just the lack of light. It was a weight, a physical pressure that sat on the chest of every soul trapped in the limestone fissure. The rat's nest had become a capsule of humanity suspended in a white void, smelling of unwashed bodies, pine resin, and the metallic tang of anxiety. Jem sat by the fire, whittling a piece of cedar. At 16, he had learned the value of keeping his hands busy. Idleness was where the fear crept in. He watched his guests, his charges, with a stoic detachment that masked his own exhaustion. Sheriff Tatum was sleeping fitfully, his blackened hands bandaged in strips of petticoat. Mrs. Garrison was humming a hymn, off-key and trembling, while kneading the air as if she were still in her bakery. Then the scream shattered the fragile peace. It was a raw, primal sound that bounced off the stone walls, making Copper jump to his feet, hackles raised. Jessa Hollister was curled on her side near the warmth of the fire, clutching her stomach. Her face, usually so full of gentle kindness, was twisted into a mask of agony. Her mother Mary was hovering over her, panic widening her eyes until they showed white all around. "It's too early," Mary cried, her voice rising an octave. "Dear God, it's 2 months, too early." Jem froze. The knife slipped in his hand, nicking his thumb. He knew how to trap rabbits. He knew how to splint a dog's leg. He had even helped Silas Vance birth a breech calf during a thunderstorm when he was 14. But this was human. This was terrifying. Dr. Garrett, the town physician who had been dragged in with a broken leg on day 2, struggled to pull himself upright. He was delirious with pain, his face gray with fever. But the instinct of the healer cut through the fog. "Water," Garrett barked, his voice weak but authoritative. "Boil it, and clean cloths. Now!" Jem sprang into action. The paralysis of the boy vanished. The efficiency of the survivor took over. "I got the water!" Jem shouted. He grabbed the 2 largest buckets and ran to the back chamber. He moved with a frantic energy, dipping the ladle into the spring, splashing water onto his boots. He hauled the heavy buckets back to the fire, his muscles burning. "Mr. Hollister, build it up," Jem ordered the blacksmith. "We need heat, but watch the smoke. Keep the draft clear." Thomas Hollister, a man who had once looked at Jem as if he were a stain on the sidewalk, nodded obediently. He fed the fire, his large hands shaking as he arranged the wood exactly as Jem had taught him. "Mrs. Peeton," Jem turned to the mayor's wife. The haughty woman was pressed against the wall, looking horrified. "We need blankets. Tear them into strips. Now!" "But they're imported wool," Prudence stammered, clutching her shawl. "Tear them!" Jem roared. It was the first time he had raised his voice. The command hit her like a slap. She blinked, looked at the screaming girl, and began to rip the expensive fabric with trembling hands. For the next 4 hours, the cave ceased to be a shelter. It became a battlefield. The storm raged outside, a chaotic symphony of wind and ice trying to break in. But inside, a different kind of struggle was waging, a war between life and death. Jessa's cries were terrible, punctuated by the low, steady instructions of the crippled doctor and the soft weeping of her mother. Jem felt helpless. He was the provider, the engineer, the boy who could fix anything with a piece of wire and a rock. But he couldn't fix this. He stood near the entrance tunnel, regulating the airflow, keeping the smoke from choking them, while they fought to bring a new life into a dying world. Copper paced between Jem and Jessa. The 3-legged dog sensed the distress. He didn't bark. He would trot over to Jessa, whine softly and lick her hand when she reached out in pain, then trot back to Jem, leaning his heavy head against the boy's thigh. "It's okay, boy," Jem whispered, burying his hand in the dog's fur. "She's fighting." Then the screaming stopped. A heavy, suffocating silence filled the chamber. It was heavier than the stone above their heads. The wind outside seemed to hold its breath. Jem stepped forward, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He saw Dr. Garrett slump back against the wall, utterly spent. He saw Mrs. Hollister weeping, her face buried in her hands. "Is it—" Jem started, but the word dead wouldn't leave his throat. Then a sound. It started as a wet gurgle, then a cough, and finally a thin, wailing cry. It was a tiny sound, pathetic against the roar of the blizzard, but to Jem it sounded like a cannon blast. "She's alive," Dr. Garrett wheezed, wiping blood from his hands onto his ruined trousers. "She's tiny, a little bird, but she's got lungs." Mrs. Hollister lifted a bundle wrapped in the strips of Prudence Peaton's expensive wool. Jessa, pale as the snow outside and drenched in sweat, reached out her arms. Jem walked over, his boots silent on the dirt floor. The group parted for him. He looked down at the bundle. The baby was impossibly small. Her skin was translucent, red and wrinkled, her eyes squeezed shut against the firelight. She looked fragile, like she might break if the wind touched her. "A girl," Jessa whispered, her voice a ghost of itself. She looked up at Jem. Her eyes were exhausted, but they held a fierce, burning light. We didn't think she'd make it." "She's a fighter," Jem said, his voice rough. "Born in a blizzard, she's got grit." Jessa touched the baby's cheek. "We're going to name her Hope." It was a cliché. It was the kind of name people in books gave babies. But in that cave, with the smell of wood smoke and blood, with 27 frozen refugees watching, it was the only name that made sense. "Hope," Jem repeated. He looked around the circle. He saw the sheriff, the blacksmith, the mayor's wife, the baker. They were dirty, starving, and terrified. But they were smiling. For a moment, the cold didn't matter. The hunger didn't matter. Jem realized something then. He wasn't just the landlord of the rat's nest anymore. He wasn't the Vance kid who slept in the barn. He was part of this. He had helped build the fire that warmed this child. He had carried the water that washed her. For 16 years, Jem had been alone. Even in a house full of people, he had been alone. But as Copper limped over and rested his chin on Jessa's knee, gazing adoringly at the new arrival, Jem felt a strange warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. He sat down next to the sheriff. "You did good, son," Tatum rasped, not looking at him, but leaning his shoulder slightly against Jem's arm. "We ain't out of it yet," Jem said, the practical survivalist taking back control. But he didn't move away. The baby cried again, louder this time. A challenge to the storm. Outside, the wind slammed against the mountain, furious that it had failed to claim them. But inside, life had just won a major victory. And as the night wore on, Jem noticed something else. The pressure in his ears, the dull ache that had been his constant companion for 5 days, was fading. He looked at the smoke drifting lazily toward the crack in the ceiling. It wasn't swirling anymore. It was rising straight up. The storm was breaking. The 8th day didn't bring warmth. It brought the silence. The screaming gale that had battered the limestone cliffs for a week didn't just vanish. It gasped, sputtered, and finally died, leaving behind a stillness so profound it felt heavy on the ears. Inside the cave, the change was electric. Jem looked up from the embers. His face was smudged with soot, his eyes rimmed with red, and his hands were raw. But the 16-year-old felt it in his bones. The pressure in his skull had lifted. "It's over," Jem whispered. He grabbed the shovel he had used to keep the ventilation shaft clear. "Copper, let's go." It took Jem and Thomas Hollister 2 hours to dig a tunnel through the snowdrift blocking the entrance. When the shovel finally broke through, A beam of light shot into the dark passage. It wasn't the gray, filtered light of a storm. It was blinding, brilliant gold. Jem squeezed through the gap and blinked, shielding his eyes. The world he knew was gone. Copper Ridge had been erased. In its place was an alien landscape, a rolling ocean of white sculpted into waves by the wind. The familiar landmarks, the saloon, the livery stable, the fences, were buried. Only the chimney of the mayor's house and the church spire poked through the drifts like tombstones. Copper scrambled past Jem, diving into the snow, rolling on his back, barking with pure, unadulterated joy. One by one, the survivors emerged. They stood on the ledge, squinting against the glare, but the joy was quickly replaced by a somber realization. They looked toward the valley, then back at the hole that had saved them. This was the reckoning. Sheriff Tatum, his hands heavily bandaged, walked over to Jem. The lawman looked at the devastation below, then at the teenager in the oversized coat. "I owe you a tally, son," Tatum said, his voice thick with emotion. "I owe you everything." "You don't owe me nothing, Sheriff," Jem said, kicking at the snow. I didn't want to be alone." "You ain't alone," Tatum said firmly. "Not anymore." Then came the moment that changed the soul of Copper Ridge. Emmett Tanner, the town bully who had bet $5 that Jem would freeze, approached. He looked wrecked, his arrogance stripped away by hunger and fear. He stopped in front of Jem. "I was a fool," Emmett choked out. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled wad of bills. "I bet against you. I bet on you dying. Take it." Jem looked at the money, then at the man. "I don't want your money, Emmett. Just don't throw rocks at my dog no more." Later that afternoon, a search party led by Jem found the Vance farm. The roof of the respectable house had collapsed under the weight of the snow. Silas and Martha, the people who had kicked Jem out on his 16th birthday to save a few dollars, were gone. Their greed had bought them nothing but a colder grave. Jem never went back to being a stray. He grew up in Sheriff Tatum's house, but he never stopped watching the sky. He became a legendary mining engineer in Montana, a man respected not for his pedigree, but for his uncanny ability to read the earth. Copper, the three-legged hero, lived 6 more good years, sleeping by the fire and eating steak every Sunday. The lesson of Copper Ridge remains written in stone. It is not the loudest voice that saves the world, nor the richest. Sometimes salvation comes from the ones we overlook, the ones who are watching the horizon while the rest of us are watching ourselves. So here is my question for you. If you were in Jem's shoes, kicked out and mocked by your whole town, would you have saved them? Or would you have locked the cave door and let the storm do its work? Tell me your honest answer in the comments below. And if you love stories about underdogs, survival, and justice, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell. This is Tales of the Finder, and I'll see you in the next story. Stay warm out there.